Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 73rd New Social Environment. I'm Cal and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Toby Kamps and Michael Armitage. A few quick notes before we get started. We close all our lunchtime conversations with a poem, and we're delighted to have the poet Rindon Johnson reading today's poem. The Brooklyn Rail stands in solidarity with the uprisings unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Rhea Milton, Dominique Remy Fells, and Toyin Salau. And in response to generations of structural violence against Black communities, Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support ongoing action in the struggle for racial justice. Before I introduce our guest and host, we'd like to begin with a brief moment of silence. And now to introduce today's host. Toby Kamps is a former director of the Blaffer Museum of Art and curator of modern contemporary art at the Menil Collection. He is now the director of external projects, the White Cube Gallery, and is an editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. So Toby, I'll hand it off to you.
Thanks very much, Cal. Before we get started, I want to send a big thanks out to you, Cal, to Nick Bennett, Fong Bui, and everybody there for throwing us this online lifeline, the new social environment. It's been a great thing as we weather the storms that are coming at us. And I also want to send a big thanks out to Michael for agreeing to speak with us tonight. I'm very excited to talk with him about the work and to see where this all goes. So I want to just give you a little bit of information about Michael now. He was born in 1984 in Nairobi, Kenya, and lives and works there and in London. He paints dreamlike narrative scenes in oil on stitched together panels of lubugo bark cloth from Uganda that's traditionally used for burial shrouds. When stretched taut, this support has occasional holes and coarse indents, which he incorporates into his compositions. Michael says he uses lubugo both to locate and destabilize the subject of his paintings. Applying his paint in layers, Armitage scrapes, revises, and repaints his compositions. East Africa provides his subject matter, its urban and rural landscapes, colonial and modern architecture, its advertisements, its lush vegetation, and its animal life. Underlying his rich colors and fantastical imagery is a quiet exposition of Kenya's often harsh realities, its political conflicts, violence, and extreme disparities in wealth. In a voice that is in turn lyrical and phantasmagorical, Armitage reflects on the pleasures and terrors of the everyday in the country of his birth. He is inspired by terrible events such as the Westgate shopping mall attack in which 67 people were killed and the persecution of women and gay people that happens far too often in Africa. He also is reflected on his memories of volatile mass gatherings such as the huge political rallies leading up to the 2017 election. But he also draws inspiration from lighter sources, including music videos and social media gossip, using them to create telling and humorous takes on the problems and mysteries of life. Armitage says, painting is a way of thinking through something, trying to understand an experience or an event a little better, and trying to communicate something of the problem to others. Distilling his memories and observations of East Africa into paintings in his London studio, he creates works that manage to exist in two realms at once. It feels both distant and otherworldly and present and pressing. Michael received his BA in Fine Art from the Slade School of Fine Art in London in 2007 and a Postgraduate Diploma from the Royal Academy Schools in 2010. He's had solo exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art Sydney, the Fondazione Sandretto Re Robodengo in Turin, the South Gallery London, the Turner Contemporary in Margate, the Berkeley Art Museum, the Pacific Film Archive in San Francisco. I believe the room is still up at MoMA now, a room dedicated to his work, and he's been featured in major group exhibitions around the world, including the 58th Venice Biennale in 2019, Prospect 4 in New Orleans in 2017, and the 13th Biennial of Lyon in France in 2015, to name only a few. So to get the conversation started, I wanted to ask Michael if you could tell us your artistic origin story. How did you get your start?
Hi, Toby. Thanks so much for the introduction, and before I say anything, I just wanted to also say thank you to Cal, to Nick, to Fong, to the entire team at Brooklyn Rail, and thank you so much for having me, onto this and for the discussion. So was that how did I begin?
Yes.
I began as most people begin drawing, really, as a child, and from maybe the first time, as I suppose as a typical boy would, I drew a jet plane or something like that, or a car, and it looked remotely like a car. I was kind of hooked, really, and that was it. Then I began spending a lot of time, instead of running around playing, just drawing, really, and slowly that bled into school time. And then I was very lucky to have a dedicated teacher who would allow me to kind of come around on weekends and spent a lot of time setting me projects to do, which I loved, and then began painting when I was 10 or 11 years old. So it's funny because painting in particular for me feels as much a part of my life as eating or breathing. It's not something that, it's become integral to how I am and to how I live in this world. So it's not something that I question on that level. And it's become a kind of, a way of existing, really.
And when did you move to the UK?
I first came over here when I was 12. I went to a boarding school in Northern England, which really wasn't from me. And then I lasted all of about 3 months and then went back to Kenya again. I then came back again when I was 16, again to a boarding school where I kind of finished the last 2 years of school, and then I studied in London from 2002 for about 8 years. Started at at Byam Shaw for a foundation course, then went to the Slade, then I went to the Royal Academy for my postgraduate, and I've been between London and Nairobi ever since then, really.
Were you always a figurative painter?
I certainly was when I started, seeing as I was 6. And then throughout art school, throughout my foundation course, throughout my BA, I was basically making figurative paintings. And then I got to a point at the beginning of my postgraduate where I was questioning the use of a figure in painting, and I was kind of questioning all the elements that bring up a painting and that a painting kind of needs to exist. So down to image, support, color, material, ideas. And at that point, I took the figure out of my paintings and I began making these kind of abstract compositions that sometimes related to figures, but were much more loose explorations of ideas that, to be honest, I'm still thinking about and working on today. But then, after working mainly as an abstract painter for the best part of sort of three years, I began thinking about the relevance of painting in Kenya and in East Africa. And one of the things to me that was clear is that there isn't a huge audience, and certainly not a kind of gallery going audience. And so if I wanted to make my paintings have a kind of immediacy and relevance to anyone that walked off the street, that one way of doing that would be to have a reflection of the people that I was interested in talking to. And so then that made me start considering putting the figure back into my work. And then as soon as I started on that, that was a real kind of shift, because I've been through quite a difficult a difficult few years with my practice where, because I was questioning everything, I was questioning and doubted anything that I enjoyed making, and parts of my practice that felt frivolous or, you know, or excessive to the core of what I wanted to get across. I had cut out a lot of things that, for me, are quite important, not only to my practice, but just to an enjoyment in making, which I think is perhaps something that I hadn't really understood how kind of necessary that was in making paintings. For me, was to find something revelatory about the practice, through the practice, sorry. So yeah, so, and the figure was certainly one of those things, you know. Then the question was, if it is a figure, how do you represent the figure? How abstracted should the figure be? And I started making quite flat, colored figures, thinking about the work of Jacob Lawrence, of Bob Thompson. And I really, like, I was really taken by the kind of ambition of the migration series, and that, you know, as an artist, you could try and, in effect, describe an entire culture through a series of paintings. And in doing that, just talk about humanity on so many levels, you know, whether it was incredibly basic or, you know, much more nuanced and, or much more crude. That group of paintings had a huge effect on me when thinking about bringing figures back into my work. So then the evolution then changed and is still changing, you know, from one body of work to the next, the sort of way the figure is represented and painted within my work.
You mentioned thinking about an audience in Kenya, and you still maintain a studio there, but you do, it seems like you do drawing and idea gathering in Nairobi, but you do the preponderance of your painting here in London. And can you talk about what it's like to live in both of these worlds, and the process and how it is different and how it evolves in these two places?
Yeah, I think so in terms of effect on the work and on the actual part of painting, I don't feel like it has that much of an effect, with the exception of when I'm in London, because of the museums and, you know, the collections that are here. There's access to the Western art history and to some, you know, pretty extraordinary paintings on your doorstep. So when looking for, you know, for a little bit of help with the painting, you can very easily go there and find a whole plethora of artists who've kind of tried to resolve through their own means one issue or another. And I suppose in many ways that's actually one of the things that's kind of beautiful about being a painter, is that you're constantly living alongside history. You know, at the end of the day, you're dealing in the same matter, and you're trying to make something active and relevant in the way that artists 600 years ago were. So there's a real kind of constant presence. And I suppose Guston is someone who spoke about that beautifully as well, of, you know, as you continue working, one artist leaves the studio after another. But to be able to go and effectively bring those artists into the studio in the first place is, certainly for me, feels like one of the biggest privileges, if not the biggest privilege, of being a painter and working in London. In terms of subjects and research, all of that, the kind of on the ground, more nuanced aspects of my practice, all of that happens when I'm back in Kenya. And the drawings, some of which you can see behind me, are usually made from kind of either life or from photographic sources, stuff that I've taken, stuff that other people have taken, or from videos and stuff that I find online. So really, I don't actually feel that geography has an effect on the paintings in terms of when they're being made, because that's quite an insular act in a way. But it certainly does have an effect on allowing me to reflect on certain subjects from a different context, which in many ways is something that I would like my paintings to do in themselves, is to provide a space for reflection.
You've described your use of lubagu bark cloth as a kind of breakthrough. When did you discover that? And can you talk about what it opened up for you exactly, and what it is a little bit too?
Yeah, sure. So at that time, I was making these horrendous paintings. They were kind of these like scribbles on woven palm leaf mats. But the thing with them that I found kind of so repulsive is that whenever I looked at them, they looked like exactly what they were, which was paint on a woven palm leaf mat. And there was this thing where the surface began to self-exoticize. It became like a kind of the surface itself became like a kind of fetish object. And that completely took away from all the other things that a painting can do. And it became a very crude gesture. So I started then looking, you know, for using lots of different materials. And then when I was walking around a tourist stall with a friend of mine who was visiting me in Nairobi, I came across this guy who was selling placemats, you know, something to put your beer on and soak up beer stains in the evenings, or for your plates and dinnerware at night. When I saw that, I immediately thought, hang on a sec, that's interesting, you know, just as a material, because it's kind of like a canvas. So I then started researching it, and it took me quite a long time, because I found out that the process for making the cloth is protected by UNESCO. And so I had gone through the UNESCO offices in Nairobi trying to figure out if I could get some. And I spent about 6 months being sent in circles and didn't get anywhere. So I asked an uncle of mine who's Ugandan, who is Buganda, who are the people that make the cloth. And he then put me in touch with his brother-in-law, who then put me in touch with the guys out in the bush. And, you know, I started getting quite a lot of it through them and through that quite circuitous route, but much more direct than UNESCO. When I then had the material, and at first, because it's such a beautiful material in its own right, and there's a lot of work that goes into every single one of them, because it's the outer bark of a tree, it has a lot of holes, it has a lot of irregularities, every single one has its own character. And then through the process of stripped, soaked, burnt, beaten, you end up with a flat cloth, but one that has a lot of irregularities. And because of the holes in it, the guys then who make it stitch up the holes. And so the cloth in itself has all these beautiful little, you know, marks and stitchings and repairs in it, which are done with a single blade of grass every time they repair them. So I had this thing that I knew had this enormous amount of work going into it and was incredibly beautiful. And so I didn't really want to then cover it in paint, you know. So I put it on the wall, and again, it began to function just like the woven palm leaf mats, where it was kind of overly fetishizing the fact that the ground was something different, you know, and then you couldn't really see the painting. The eureka moment, however pathetic and small, was when I realized that if I stretched it onto a normal stretcher and then primed it, it began to operate just like a normal canvas. And then the kind of subversion and location of the painting that was going on top of that began to be much more subtle and interesting to me, and began to kind of reflect the complexities of cultural dynamics at home that I was interested in exploring. And so that must have been around 2012 that I first started using it, or 2011 maybe, 2011. Yeah. And then it's been a slow, then at that time when I first started using it, I was still like very much thinking about Jacob Lawrence and making these quite flat colored area paintings. And then just through, thinking through ideas of exoticism and self-exoticism and the effect of representing oneself to another culture, however close or far, and what that does, meant that I began thinking about the language of the painting differently and wanting to bring in elements of exoticism into the language. So in a way, it was kind of once again embedded within the painting.
This is it locates and destabilizes the paintings in a context that's both maybe European easel painting, but something different with an African origin there too. Speaking about exoticism too, you've said that Gauguin is your mentor. Can you elaborate on that? He's sort of the ultimate exoticizer in painting, isn't he?
I've been asked this. I actually didn't correct this when you sent me questions earlier, just simply because I've been asked this so many times, and it's a misquote. Gauguin was not my mentor, and I didn't.
Okay.
Alas,
it's all over the place. I apologize.
But I thought it's no. I wanted you to say that because I think it's a kind of. Somebody had said that to me, that Gauguin was like a mentor, which was again a misunderstanding of what I was saying. In many ways, it is and it isn't really, because in many ways, the education that I feel that I have in painting is from a handful of friends that I studied with, and then looking at other people's paintings. Gauguin for me was a really important artist because, exactly like you said, he's kind of the king of the exotic, really. But also he's interesting because of his idea of himself, and that this kind of exoticizing that he was doing of all of these, this other culture, was because he saw himself in a way as that, with huge, and there are huge issues around Gauguin, the way he lived his life and, having 13-year-old wives, and, spreading and contracting STDs to the communities that he went to. Like, there are huge issues like that, again, for me, are embedded with this idea of the exotic. Sex is embedded in the idea of the exotic. Taking advantage of another culture is embedded in the idea of the exotic. Presenting yourself without your own history to another culture is also in this idea of the exotic, that both sides, function as the outsider wants it to at the beginning. Things then very quickly begin to fall apart and deteriorate, and but the kind of impulses behind the wanting of something to be exotic, and of the person who's being exotic also being exoticized, playing up to that, was something that was interesting to me because of the way tourism worked and because of the development of the impact of kind of development on our cultures at home. There was a real kind of strange symmetry to that. And so to find aspects of Gauguin's paintings that were kind of unmistakably his, to a kind of art-going viewer, was important because I really wanted to explore how far that dumbing down effect goes, and how much the cliche inhibits what you're looking at, how much one's own ideas of this is from another place, these colors are reaffirming that, this subject looks like that, but then when you actually look at what you're doing and taking part in, you're dealing with people's lives who are every bit as important and meaningful as as your own, however different they seem. And again, I was interested in Gauguin as exotic, as opposed to looking the other way around, where someone from home would look to to England in this, with some sense of reverence, perhaps because of the way that colonialism worked, and and the racial elements of colonialism developed to create this idea that the colonizer was a kind of better person. And I wasn't interested in trying to deal with that aspect of it, because for me, the thing that I felt was really slippery from from my position as a Kenyan Brit, but as a Kenyan and growing up within Kikuyu culture as well, are the points at which that culture, my culture, begins to parody itself and loses its purpose and loses its meaning. And I saw exoticism, however overt and however subtle, as being a really key aspect of that as well.
Well, you've mentioned Jacob Lawrence and the kind of epic stories of the Great Migration from the American South to the industrialized North that he spoke about in his work. And, it's an ambitious thing to try to look at and understand and inhabit another culture. It's a grand thing. And as you say, it's filled with, the way there is filled with pitfalls, but it's, I've always felt like, why are we here if not to try to figure it all out? And I think that your work makes a beautiful attempt at that. And with that, I think we ought to talk about a number of works. And Lewis, if you could back up to the paintings, perhaps on the slideshow, would you mind talking about a few of these paintings and telling the audience what's going on in them?
Yeah, sure. So the Fourth Estate came from going to the last opposition rally in Kenya in our 2017-2018 elections. I had this idea for a number of years and had actually made another painting called And So It Is, thinking through this, but where I wanted to explore kind of public displays of power dynamics. And I was interested in what was given and what was taken, in the support of politics, and at the point at which you commit to following a leader. And so I wanted to go along to this thing to kind of get a sense of that and to feel it alive and in practice. And so I joined one of the local news stations called K24 News, And the guys took me along for, you know, the filming of this rally. I was supposed to do one of the opposition and then one of the incumbents rallies, but then they took out the last day, and I wanted the two last kind of major rallies that they held in their strongholds, but they then cut it off. So I was only able to go to this rally. They shortened the rally period before voting could happen. So when we got there in the morning, I mean, it must have been sort of 10 a.m. and there were already 5,000 or 6,000 people in this park, which is called Uhuru Park, and it overlooks the city. It's one of our central parks in the city. It's really beautiful as well. And one section of Uhuru Park is just, it's a hillside with a couple kind of large dead trees, one of which is in this painting in it. And if you're on that hillside, you look down and there's a kind of sort of gazebo area with a stage, which is where, you know, a lot of political functions and things take place. We got there and it was already pretty carnivalesque. There were guys who were dressed up, you know, I still haven't really figured out who was behind the kind of visual metaphors of the opposition clothing, but they dressed their supporters up as clowns with these kind of glowing orange clown hair outfits, superhero outfits. One guy had Da Vinci's Last Supper hanging from his neck, and above Jesus's head, the opposition leader, Raila Odinga, was floating quite awkwardly, along with a couple of his sidekicks. And then just the sound, you know, vuvuzelas blowing all over the place. The music was extraordinary as well. A lot of stuff that was specific to the rallies that pop musicians had played. The sound and the atmosphere was kind of overwhelming, to a point that, although I'm describing these things now, when I got there, I was just taken, not by the visuals, but just by the feeling of being part of something, you know, and something positive is what it felt, you know. Then as the day went on, I had a radio interview that I was doing, and so I had to then verbally describe what we were seeing. And as I started describing it, it began to just sound like I was describing a Goya painting, you know, or a Goya etching. These guys were perched in the tree, and there was this bizarre kind of, you know, visual metaphor where you had them in the tree perched there, and then the tree behind was full of marabou stalks that are, you know, these enormous stalks and scavengers. And then, you know, you had on stage, you had the politicians start kind of belching all of these quite acidic ideas and, you know, whipping up discontent and hatred and everything, the sort of language of a revolution, which was really at odds with the feeling of the rally until they started speaking. You know, and that was quite like that's when it got really intense in a very different sort of way. But you had all these different elements, and when I was talking about them and describing them, you know, and I suppose this is from maybe looking at paintings a little bit too much, everything that I could see these kind of equivalences through history with, you know, that however bizarre and specific this moment felt, and this type of expression of support, it felt like it had been represented already, and that became really interesting to me. So the image of these guys on the tree singed into my my memory and my imagination from the point of describing it. As this rally went on, and the different politicians, you know, started very junior and then became more senior as they went on, the crowd built up, and I mean, it must have been sort of 50 or 60,000 people at that point. And where I was with the guys from K24 News was the kind of press area at the front. And there was a huge surge when the leader had arrived, as everyone who had been waiting the entire day pushed to try and get to the front of the stage, which ended up with us kind of trying to protect the satellite for the feed by holding a metal bar against all these pushing guys who, you know, some of them were trying to shove lollipops into my mouth and like laughing again because, you know, everyone says Muzungu, Muzungu, which means a white person, foreigner, foreigner. You know, and we're laughing at the fact that I was there and also not taking photos of them and just like trying to chat, you know, while holding this bar. But basically, the kind of impressions of that day, and then the photos that I was sent by the photojournalists, where the guys that I had seen that we were standing with, who were the visually most striking, with slogans on them and everything, they turned up in these photographs all over the country, like in all these different rallies, and were kind of like this paid, you know, paid little gang that went around whipping up, you know, the kind of the pathos and the emotion of the entire scene. But also when things did turn violent, as sometimes they did, they were the guys who were throwing stones and being shot at by police. You know, and that really was something that again questioned this whole idea of support, you know. And then you have obviously the impact of the state and policing on support, and you know, and all of that. But yeah, from those photos and what that kind of, that extra layer that was added to it all, the next kind of year and a half's worth, 2 years worth of paintings came. So this was the very first in that group of paintings. And again, you know, I'm not interested in it being about political characters. For me, it wasn't important that it was Raila Odinga or Uhuru Kenyatta or whoever was the politician. You know, I didn't want this to be a bit of political propaganda as a painting. I was more interested in the people. And so I started thinking, how can I represent a politician or represent the idea of the leader, this kind of repulsive character that from the outside you don't really know why anybody would follow him or her, but from the inside is obviously the only focus, you know. And so I started thinking about this kind of like George Orwell, Animal Farm, and then also the history of painting in Kenya, where animals play a really significant part in talking about politics. And that's where the toad kind of came in and became important, and became my leader for the paintings. So that's the kind of setup where you end up with what maybe looks like a bit of a surreal scene, but it's very much a painting of what was there, with the exception of frogs.
Does the toad have cultural significance, or it's just your emblem of this sort of repulsive yet absolutely mesmerizing leader?
There are certain things that I had been thinking about, but not to do with, you know, kind of a Kenyan cultural perspective that would then be some kind of signifier and means it wasn't symbolic in that sense. So no, yeah.
Lewis, could we move to another painting? This is another scene from, or what, the Promised Land. You mentioned that there was almost a quasi-religious aspect to some of these rallies.
Yeah, totally. So every time the leader came out, he would say, "I'm going to lead you to Canaan, to the Promised Land. You know, just come and vote for me." Like hardly original political rhetoric, but for some reason seems to work time and time again. Maybe that's what we're all looking for. So I wanted to kind of have that idea explored in a painting that showed kind of these different stages of support, really, and an evolution of support. And this really came out of the photographs that I was sent by the journalists, as opposed to the images that I had kind of collected and seen from that day. With the exception of the little boy in the bottom left, he was kind of scurrying around around the stage, picking stuff up, and on that day. But in it, I'd also wanted kind of the threat and the presence of policing, and the effect of that at home to be this not represented but obvious presence. So, I wanted the tear gas to be the thing that made these figures who had moved from right at the back, just being guys who were kind of marching and shouting, for their bit, to the guys who then at the front stage are much more active, carrying the banners. And for the banner, I was thinking of it having some sort of seductive ideology. And then I was thinking, like, how can you represent a seductive ideology without, that isn't questioned enough, without painting a slogan onto it and saying this is this. So I started thinking about the female nude in Western art history, and how that kind of was this seductive ideology throughout, and operated in different ways, sometimes subversive and sometimes affirmative. And so I thought that would be, my kind of call to arms, basically, for these guys, what they were following. It was then important to have this girl sitting up on the balcony, who was based on a 10-year-old girl called Mercy, who was shot by a stray bullet when some of the protesters, or the guys from the rally who had gone back to one of the slums in Nairobi, had then been followed by the police, and then there was a standout and shooting, and this young girl was shot and killed, and she had absolutely nothing to do with it. So I wanted her presence to be part of the painting. So this came, and then it really came out of thinking about trying to make a history painting, as in a sense that's the kind of genre that I was in, with trying to deal with real events, basically. And one of the things that I liked about history paintings is often they are they're evoked from the artist's imagination, however much they're supposed to be representing and presenting a history. They're often, if you think of Manet's execution of Maximilian, like, that's such an extraordinarily simple composition, the Maximilian who's getting shot, the mechanized, forces, wall, kids at the back, little hill on the side. And there's something about how anonymous the setting is, yet specific the action was, that for me was really kind of a key to trying to do something that was like a history painting. He gives you so much space to be there, to be anywhere for that painting, in Manet's Maximilian. Those are the kind of things I was thinking about in this.
Cal, how are we for time? I see that there are lots of great questions piling up. Should we keep going through some of these paintings, maybe?
Yeah,
or
I think
maybe I think some of the questions seem to be relevant to these, but maybe we could talk about these quickly and then turn it over to questions, because I see there's some really good ones on the chat.
That sounds good to me. Michael's talking about his work is really fascinating. So
Yeah.
let's keep going.
So
Cool.
Midas.
So, yeah, sorry, you wanted me to say something?
Yes,
cool?
I'm sorry. Yeah, if you could, do you
No
mind
problem.
talking
Yeah,
about
yeah, no
these
worries.
individual works? Yeah.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, so Midas, you know, I was taken by the story of Midas. I mean, it's so familiar. You know, everyone said Midas touch, blah, 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 Midas, Midas, Midas. But I was taken by the story when rereading it recently. And the fact that Midas was this, like, a ruler with such good intentions and so much kind of hope for what he could do, you know, and his wish that everything that he touched turn to gold wasn't just about greed. It was also about helping his people in a time of drought, you know, that there was kind of this, like, blinding kind of desire to help and to do good, that then, you know, in the way that the Greek gods play their tricks, you know, turned to be the most fateful thing that the guy could have done, and, you know, totally isolated himself, turned his family into inanimate statues, you know, and then he repented immediately, but had to live with that through, you know, being given these ass's ears, and hiding that, and hiding the kind of shame that he had from basically wanting to do good. And so I was interested in that point where he was told if he washes with red wine, that's the point at which, and then he wakes up the next morning, then he would have that touch, because that, to me, was the single most hopeful point in the entire story, that point basically of contact of wine to his skin. And so then I wanted to make this painting, and I was thinking again of the setting of that, and that kind of existing somewhere in northern Kenya, an area that's prone to drought, where, you know, a lot of very difficult politics and day-to-day lives exists, and where you could almost imagine somebody trying to give up everything for a solution that seemed to be the one that would clear all their problems, but was still quite complicated and problematic. So yeah, so I made this of that guy, and this came after, I made this just after going to Venice for the Biennale and seeing Titian's Pieta, where, I mean, that painting is the single greatest bit of painting I have ever come across and seen. And every single figure is unique in that. And it's not unique because they look different. It's unique because they're painted differently. You know, there are moments where Christ's body is almost dematerializing in front of you because of how he's painted. There are these extraordinarily quick, or apparently quick, gestures that describe, you know, that describe Mary, that describe some of the other figures, that describe the lions at the base of the columns, that, you know, that then you have this kind of extraordinary little passage where he's painting this kind of family history and story into it. There are all these different ways of bringing a painting together and making it architectural elements, totally non-architectural, you know, elusive aspects of space. And I was thinking, like, how can I try and, you know, take that on? So in this, again, I really wanted to have the figures in it be kind of specific to themselves, in as much as being individual characters, but at the end of the day, a character in a painting is just paint, you know. So you've got to be specific in the paint, and then that's kind of how I was thinking of this. Just in case anyone thinks that's a leopard or a hyena, it's actually a cheetah. Yeah. Yeah, so that was kind of Midas, really. Yeah. Which is actually, funny enough, linked to NSO. So the landscape in the background is the same landscape, you know, in the background of Midas is this exact landscape of NSO. So it's kind of it's the same space, you know. Yeah, so this painting came out of thinking about landscape and the representation of landscape. And it's something I've been kind of, one of the maybe less expressed preoccupations that I've had about place, where what really got me interested initially was this idea of, you know, this idea of the sublime, and how for me to walk in an empty landscape at home, I never had that sense of, oh my God, this is so wonderful, what? It was more like fear. Like, you know, what's in that bush? You know, is there somebody hiding there? Is there an animal hiding there? Is there, you know, is there this? There's a big open landscape was threat. And I found that a really, which is probably also partly from growing up in the city, you know, but I found that, like, this idea that, which again, I suppose is about the idea of paradise coming from a kept garden as opposed to paradise being a wild place, you know. Yeah. For me, that's what happened to the land. And I suppose industrialization turned epic landscapes into kept gardens.
And NSO, it is sort of a kept garden, isn't it? It's a high-end game park, from what I can gather.
Yeah, exactly. And so NSO was interesting to me on lots of different levels. So when, you know, when the colonials did their thing and they got to Kenya, they were looking for some people to kind of walk around and show them about. A lot of the guys they kind of took on were Samburu or Maasai, and this is their home. And it was interesting when, you know, when I was talking to these guys, I was when I was there, I was like, you know, so what were you guys up to in that time? How come we never hear about you? You hear about the Kalenjins, you hear about, you know, the Kikuyus, you hear about all these different other cultures in Kenya that stood up and fought. And the guy was like, well, you know, land has never been something that we owned. We're passing, we're nomadic, you know, we have our cows and that's it. So that these guys came and settled here, it really didn't bother us that much, because at the end of the day, they weren't taking our cows. And, you know, and so it was interesting that the land was something totally different. And this landscape as well is not specifically this farm, but this area is super contested, because now all these guys, you know, all the herders, the Samburu herders, they're all trying to come back onto this land to herd, you know, and to graze their thousands and thousands of heads of cattle when it's dry, and they can't get there because it's all private ranches. And so there's a lot of kind of socio-political tension in the land. So I was interested in this idea of what land, kind of how land functions, but then also the representation of land. And specifically where, if you look at paintings, you know, from people that have a kind of colonial legacy in Kenya, there's often this romantic, quite realistic representation of the land where it's about the space, the big sky, the big open land, you know, that it fulfills all these ideas of, you know, the safari, it fulfills all of these romantic ideas. Whereas when you look at many of the landscapes that are painted by Kenyans, and the landscape is almost like another character, you know, it's almost like it's abstracted and it plays a part in the painting, not in a way that it's there to make you go, oh, so beautiful, but it's there because it's as important as the figure. And in a way, it's as alive as the figure. And the other thing that I was interested in when talking, you know, to the guys at NSE was that there had been this incredible battle, you know, a couple hundred years ago, and many Samburu had died, and I'm not sure who they were fighting, but many people had died, and they had called the place NSE, which means this rock. And this rock was none of these dramatic hills in the background. It was like a much more insignificant, small rock, but it had significance, you know, and that it wasn't the big open landscape with the cultural significance was interesting. In the background, in the hills of this landscape, was a cave, which again had all these extraordinary cave paintings. The paintings kind of date back to something like 4,000 years ago. And some of them have been added to as recently as 200 years ago. Not only that, but it's as if some of them have been redrawn and redrawn and redrawn for hundreds of years. And it fills this cave. And the most recent ones are done in ash, like white ash and goat fat. And I was just thinking, like, at night, you have this blackened cave from the soot of fires of millennia worth of fire. And just to imagine, like, the fire reflecting off the white of the ash would be extraordinary and luminous. But again, when I was asking some of the Samburu guys about it, you know, the answer for me was super interesting. I was like asking, so you know, what do these things mean? Do you know what they mean? And the answer was, well, you know, our ancestors weren't that great at drawing. So this is like a bad giraffe, and this is like this. And so, you know, and it made me think, like, this is something really important for us, for, you know, Kenya, for any country that's going through this, where we have this extraordinary history, either in a cave or in front of you in a building or in any situation. It is like that 4,000 years of painting the same symbols in a cave could be so quickly forgotten and dismissed is bonkers, you know, it's absolutely crazy. And so I kind of wanted to kind of bring those cave paintings, however undecipherable they are, into this. So again, the fabric of the cloth is actually made from different shapes of the cave paintings. Those funny squiggles that are kind of yellow and green and a bit pink are also the cave paintings in that. So this again was trying to, like, make the landscape part of living culture, you know, make the people and the land what they are, which is totally together and dependent upon each other. Yeah, I think that's, yeah, there's a bunch of other stuff, but I think that's enough. Yeah.
All right, should we move on to the questions and answer portion, or would you like to? What do you think?
I think we should, and maybe it'll occur to Michael to answer a question in the context of one of these great paintings or drawings that are on the slideshow.
Sure.
Great. All right, well, our first question comes from Brian Kilt. I will ask to unmute you right now if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. Yeah, a bit of a, hello, Michael, a bit of a fanboy, but I'm sure we're in good company here.
Liking the paintings behind you.
Oh, thank you. My question is, I know you sit with your drawings and images that you work from for quite a long time. And what's the longest you've ever sat with an image in the back burner before it's gone on to a painting? And do you find there's a level of discourse between the drawn mark and the painting marks once they get onto your canvas or onto the bark?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think, you know, there's a couple drawings that I have that I know will be useful, and they still haven't been useful. And I've been saying this to myself for maybe like 15 years. So still waiting on them to find their place and their moment. But ones that I've actually used, for example, in my first year on my postgraduate, so that was 2007, I made this drawing of a hornbill. And it kind of became, I sort of made it into a tile of 4 different hornbills from this kind of creation myth. And I've just used that again and again and again and again, you know, because for me, it's operated on so many different levels, and also the kind of how abstract it is makes it quite versatile and useful in painting. And then it has its own kind of story and history. But the question about mark and drawing to painting is super interesting, because I hadn't really understood how different it was to draw with a pencil as to painting something. So when I started drawing using this ink called Prout's ink, which you can re-wet and work again. It's amazing stuff, you know, so you can leave your drawing for like 3 days and come back and still work in it. And, you know, when I started using that and I was using the brush to make the mark, even if I'm out of the studio, as long as I've kept on drawing, I don't have that thing where it's like, you know, like quite awkwardly trying to get back to doing something that's unfamiliar, where it takes you a couple of weeks to get back in, because the movement and, you know, that kind of quite calligraphic way that you can increase and decrease pressure to get a mark to do something and be expressive is still there. It still translates. So basically, to answer your question, drawing really is quite different. And then also thinking about, you know, the kind of criticisms of Titian at the time, how basically he wasn't that great at drawing, you know, but he could paint pretty well. Seeing that, and then seeing someone who was perhaps a little bit too good at drawing, you know, and the painting suffers as a result, like Michelangelo, like seeing what not having drawing in painting does, and just allowing the paint to embody the character fully, or to embody a space and only rely on tone and color to describe something is really awkward. Like I find Titian like so awkward, and, you know, like everything's kind of together and relies on each other in a way that is very, very difficult to do, but extraordinary if it does happen. So yeah, that question of drawing and painting is something like it's alive in my mind, and I'm always thinking about it, but I have no kind of definitive answer.
Yeah, I don't think there even really is one, but
yeah,
it's good to get your opinion on it. Thanks.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the question.
All right, our next question comes from Noel Kernan, who asked me to ask the question. So they said, I'm interested to know if Michael sees differences in the reactions to his work in Kenya, the UK, and the US. And also, each Labugo bark has specific physical characteristics, and to what extent do the characteristics of a specific bark influence a painting?
Cool. Yeah, so I'm just going to quick. One of the kind of most fulfilling things, as I very rarely get to show my work at home. In fact, I haven't done an exhibition in Kenya, was when like doing a presentation to some school kids, and just having the kind of, at that time I was making some work thinking about this musician Diamond Platnumz and Bikoko and all of this, and seeing that there was still a kind of a relevance like that was super cool, because that kind of the socio-political dimension of the work was kind of alive and relevant. So that was really cool. Whereas, you know, other aspects of the paintings have less of an impact like that, but maybe work in stronger ways. Like, you know, like those kids wouldn't be thinking about Gauguin at all. You know, they wouldn't be thinking about exoticism and the effects of exoticism and blah, 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 all that nonsense. Whereas, you know, if I show that in a context where the language of Gauguin is kind of relevant and important, that becomes another aspect of the painting that's reflected. And I suppose maybe one of the most unusual conversations I've had in terms of a geographical difference in talking and thinking about painting was showing some work in Hong Kong, and the criticism that I had was about the spirituality of the composition, and even that as an idea is heavy, like it's extraordinary, and just that a composition is spiritual, and of course it is. You know, it's about relationships, spatial relationships, psychological relationships. The entire that's kind of the imagined space which a painting occupies when it's off the wall and in your mind exists in there and tries to create that tension. But that was super interesting. So there are loads of different, basically, ways of reading a painting, and there are loads of different ways that culture affects reading paintings. And I feel incredibly lucky to have people respond to me from those different positions, because I always feel like it also makes me think about my work differently. And I've also forgotten the second part of that question. Sorry.
I can read it to you again. Just one moment. Okay. The second part was each labugo bark has specific physical characteristics, and to what extent do those characteristics of a specific bark influence a painting?
Yeah, sometimes it's quite major, and other times it's more subtle. So, you know, the time that a cloth has really affected one of my paintings was with this painting I made called Anthill, where I had stretched up this cloth, and for about 2 years I just left it there because it was so heavily deformed. It had these real pockets in. The surface was like really rough. It's the sort of thing where you couldn't just stick a face in it because you couldn't paint it. You know, like it was impossible to paint. I felt like I was kind of painting a prop or something, kind of going around the corner and all of that. And so it was very difficult compositionally to figure out how to use it without it being too corny. And I mean, I find a lot of the moments where my paintings do use this kind of physical relief element of the surface is super corny. And sometimes a little bit, like, I understand why people paint on flat surfaces usually. So I had this stretcher up for ages, and then I started making this group of paintings thinking about these exorcisms in Tanzania, and one of the descriptions of what was being removed from the women that were having these exorcisms was, you know, these naked old ladies riding hyenas or flying in baskets coming out of these anthills. And I had made this anthill drawing, you know, a few years back in the landscape. And again, I hadn't used it and didn't really know when it would be in use. And suddenly, just having that drawing there, reading this particular description, and then having the surface of that cloth and that painting, and how uncanny the holes in the painting matched up to the holes in the anthill. You know, that totally determined the size of the anthill in the painting. And I'm grateful for it, because there's no way I would have made it that big and awkward. You know, and it was really difficult actually to get my head around, because it totally dominated. It dominated the painting, it dominated the kind of narrative, and it really made me think about how to bring the woman and the three kind of shaitani spirit figures into the composition. So sometimes it's major like that, and other times it's much more subtle. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Our next question comes from Constanza. I'll ask to unmute you.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I wasn't expecting this, the involvement. My question is actually super simple, because with your work, I can help but, you know, besides your, the importance of your subject, which is very strong, and the fluidity of your work, I am really like, I can help but like getting really touched by the colors that you use and how that flows. Obviously, I find that color is always very important, but I just was curious about what's your approach to it and how you study that, and, you know, how you make those choices of your palette.
Thank you. Thank you. Colors. Colors kind of evolved for me when I started again in making paintings, again thinking about exoticism and so on and all these things. I really wanted to have the color palette reference that sort of painting, but then, you know, now that I've had a little bit of time, I feel like the palette has and is evolving, and is much more intuitive and much less kind of dictated by a conceptual idea. You know, if I was really interested in, you know, how someone like Seurat talks about color, how Matisse was interested in color, and this idea that, you know, the colors together change, you know, they change how each other works. And they change what they themselves are doing. And I was also interested in again, someone like Jacob Lawrence, again, is super interesting from a color perspective, because it is so direct and necessary for the attention of the subject. And so I started thinking about color in that sense. I feel like I've got a really long way to go with color, you know. I feel like such a novice when I'm messing around, and always just trying to see, you know, how dissonant two colors can be together, how complementary they can be together, what it does to something that's familiar to change its color. You know, how far can you go with something feeling recognizable and true? Like, how simple can you be? You know, how crude a decision can you make? So it's kind of an evolving thing for me. But I'm really enjoying the fact that it's become, like, I feel like that aspect of my practice has kind of been absorbed into the intuitive aspect of making work, because on the other side, there's only so far that you can go, you know, and it's not surprising because you're working off something that's already there. Yeah. Thanks for the question there.
Yeah, thank you, Constanza. Next, we have a question from our very own Fong Bui. If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Michael, Toby. Just following what Constanza questioned, Michael, she used the word fluidity, which I think that's one of the very accurate way to describe your work. But as you mentioned Manet early on, Maximilian painting, he made 4 versions of it. And it was shown actually in New York, John Elderfield curated that show in 2007. And I seen it, I interviewed John myself, and it just occurred to me that what he able to do, in addition to referencing Goya, you know, history painting have a tendency to create an aura of theatricality. Theater is a way to compel the viewer to look at it. But as you know, I mean, it's always been very difficult to control both sense of theatricality, which need to require certain stability through neoclassicism. David Ang was very good at that. But at the same time, the exotic use of color or the aspiration to a color palette, which belong to the Romantic movement. This is why Delacroix and you know, David or Ang would never get along. Never get along. So my question to you is that I think in a way, what extent of automatism, the use in which imagery can be painted with a certain fluidity, allowance, in other words, it reminds me to the various scale that you undertake. It's very similar in a way of Neil Rauch painting. Neil is one of the few painters who can undertake historical painting or narrative driven in that various scale and have the same fluidity of imagery. But his is a bit more painterly in a different way than yours. So my question is again, it's about that automatic allowance to have the image painted and draw at the same time simultaneously. And I don't know how you do it. So that's basically the question.
It's a really tricky question because, and this is probably usually how I answer questions, by answering a different question, but because basically I think it's the automatic part of painting and choices of painting are often about what a painting asks of you as the person who's making it, you know? And it's a really difficult thing to think through, because if you have a subject, and this is also part, like in no small part why, like I'm always adamant that a painting isn't about something. Like even if there's like the paintings I was talking about, you know, with the tree that are very specifically evolve out of thinking about a particular instant, the painting is not about that instant. It is the painting, you know, it is the thing itself. And that's because a painting does that, you know, it asks that of you, you know, you have to, like, or certainly I feel like I've got to follow that part of painting, because that's when it also teaches you something, and it shows you aspects of a narrative, aspects of color choice, aspects of compositional choice that you can't second guess, you know, that you can't dictate from the beginning. And it's an incredibly humbling and difficult part of painting, because once again it shows you, or certainly shows me, that I don't have it shows me how well other people have painted to be able to do the sort of things that they do, but also that, like, personally as a painter, I've got a hell of a long way to go and a lot to learn like that, and a lot more kind of experimenting and time with it, because it's very unsatisfying as well, you know, but it keeps you hungry. I hear athletes talk about kind of winning in the same way, you know, that it's this, there's something satisfying in it, but then it isn't as well, because you just need it again. You need more. You know, it's really quite intense like that. So to talk about an automatic aspect of painting is really to talk about the thing itself, and that can only be done through paint. You know, like I would find it very hard to verbalize like what on earth is going on in that process.
Yeah, I don't mean to put you on the spot, Michael, but you know how it is. It's like, for example, you take Picasso Guernica, when he made it in 37, you know, he tried to replicate that similar idea in the Massacre of Korea, which is a similar to Goya May painting, which is Manet aspired after the execution of Maximilian. But that painting is very mechanistic. Exactly, it fell in so many levels. So I guess my question again is, if indeed you claim what you did, does that mean that any form of repetition or replication of an image from one painting to the next can be borrowed, can be recalibrated in different form, reconfigured different form?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think I find it really interesting, maybe because it's something that, like, just on a personal level, I find very difficult to do. I find it interesting when painters find an image and then they work that image again and again and again and again, or like a very solid format. And they do it not over a very long period of time, but they do it really intensely. Because when you see that, you really do see the other side of a painting. You know, you begin to see in a very obvious way the part of painting that isn't about, I have this image and I'm going to represent something. You know, it's about what the stuff itself is and is doing and how that changes the character. And for me, in fact, throughout his practice, that's one of the things I find really like fascinating about a painter like Peter Doig, is that he can have the same motif for 15 years, you know, and there is something else that's happening there. And sometimes, you know, they succeed and sometimes they fail, but there is something else. And sometimes the ones that feel like they're failing have the most interesting parts of painting in them as a painter, you know, geeking out over what another painter is doing. But in a way, you know, I have to admit, I'm not a huge fan of Guernica. I think it's an epic painting. And it's awesome, you know, it's totally like out of this world, but it's also Picasso because it's so damn crude. Ooh, excuse my language. It's so crude, you know. And it's so like overly confident. Like it's just everything about it is, you know, I'm big, I'm doing it, you know, this is going to be all of this, and it works, and it is an extraordinary painting. But then when I think about like a painter like Paul Nash, for example, English painter, and he made this extraordinary painting. God, I can't remember its title, but it's of the sea, and it's also the wings of aeroplanes, and the crests of the waves turn into broken wings. But it's at the same time, it's totally devastating and totally beautiful, and has this real poetic element to it, and speaks to something so kind of deep and beyond the visceral aspect of tragedy that Picasso was representing. And I also totally take into account, look, I mean, that's one of the extraordinary paintings, but for me, which is in general my issue with a lot of Picasso. I love his blue period and rose period, but there isn't the same kind of depth for me of kind of there isn't the same kind of poetic sensibility that an artist like Goya or Manet had. I mean, even if you look at Manet and the execution of Maximilian and thinking about color, if you look at the dark black trousers in those, you know, that those guys, the soldiers are wearing, the darkest part is luminous green. How do you get to that? You know, it's like this beautiful emerald jewel is just like this deep seam. And that feels like it's a real kind of evolution of painting as opposed to thinking, and a real kind of sensitivity to what is happening on the surface.
It's so good. We have another talk because this can go for hours.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm gonna pull myself over here and allow all the last question, but stay on that thought. I will.
Yeah. Look forward to it. Thanks so much, Fong. Thank you.
Thank you, Fong. All right. Next, we've got a question from Jason Stopa. I will unmute you right now.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for such a wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks for joining. Thanks.
Yeah, I just am kind of going to piggyback actually off of Fong's question a little bit. I was also thinking of a number of contemporary painters who I felt like your work was in line with, Doig being one of them. But I thought about some of Chris O'Feely's paintings, some of the more lyrical ones, Noah Davis, Karen Mama Anderson, where there's a kind of dreamlike space that kind of borders on abstraction at times. But it struck me that work makes me, like your own, makes me look first to comprehend, and then at the same time, I'm appreciating the paint handling, the paint qualities. And maybe you could just elaborate on that balance back and forth between forcing the viewer to comprehend the image and understand what it is they're even looking at, and then kind of going back to the aesthetics.
That's I think one of the kind of most extraordinary experiences that I've had recently with a kind of living painter's work was seeing Chris O'Feely's kind of black and blue paintings, and you know, going into this darkened room with all these paintings that you could barely see. You became so aware of the fact that what you were doing was looking. And I know it sounds extraordinarily simple, but that really is the essence.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I recall that room. Yeah, those kind of almost Roman-like paintings in that room. They were very sparse, yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes, you know, they went from having like very beautiful lyrical kind of narratives in them to, you know, to lynchings, to like really, really different subjects. But, you know, and this idea of looking at night, but how much that made you aware of using your eyes was extraordinary in a way that I haven't really seen, you know, be explored by that many painters, and using such a simple kind of technique, really. And it's the sort of thing where, you know, for generations to kind of deceive the eye is what representational painting really tried to do. And obviously a lot changed in the last kind of couple hundred years, but nevertheless, you know, to see somebody try and take that on, and such a heavy idea, and to do it so well, like I was, that room sent chills down my spine, and I just wish it was a room I could walk into you know, whenever I wanted to. But yeah, I feel like I've gone way too deep into that room and forgotten your question.
It's okay. I mean, I think you've kind of answered it in a roundabout way about this difference between perception and space. So thank you.
Cool. Thanks for the question as well. Cheers.
Thank you, Jason. All right, next we have a question from Terry Myers. I will ask to unmute you.
You knew, Michael, I'd have to get in here.
Hey, Terry, good to see
Toby,
you.
it's great to see you too. So Michael was a postgrad student at the RA when I was doing a bit of teaching there. And he doesn't necessarily know this, but your group, that moment is a very key moment. And it's become even a more key moment. So I'm going to ask you to respond to something, I guess. Because I'm at your degree show, you could have walked in and been like, yeah, this kid's looking at Michael Kreber, Sigmar Polka, you know, and I remember conversations, but you know, your colleague from a year after you, Oliver Osborne, who I've stayed in touch with. So, you know, Oliver, a few years ago, asked me to write a text, and I found this sort of not really throwaway, this interview he did for an Italian website. And at one point he just says, and because I knew Oliver, I could imagine how he said it in that sort of, you know, Lush way. He's like, oh, you know, the recent history of painting from Ang to Michael Kreber, perhaps. And it just sort of like blew me away. And I thought, you guys are the generation that could get away with saying that recent painting went from Ang to Michael Kreber. So, you know, even just a few years ago, students I had, even at the RA, would never have said such a thing. I think there's something about your generation and its distance from not only modernism, but postmodernism that is at play there. And that's what I wrote about in this text about Oliver, but it comes to mind. I mean, many people maybe don't know your work from when you were a student there, but this shift.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, well, but the shift is provocative to me. You had to do what you did there the same way Oliver, a bunch of you do.
Sure. Yeah.
And there's something about being born in the mid-'80s that I'm convinced has you guys in a different place in relation to this notion of painting, where you could say something like, recent painting starts with Ang. So I'm just wondering if you have a reaction to that. You knew Oliver, you know, but it felt like it's something you could have said too. Not ending with Michael Kreber, of course.
Yeah. I think I think also it feels like something quite particular to the English education system and the scene, you know, the kind of scene where maybe at that point we were, you know, you'd had the 90s, which was all the YBAs, you know, like that was it, so loud and so, you know, and so, some amazing things being made, but you know, and you had this like real kind of then what was kind of being made towards the end of the 90s and early noughties really around then was a much more clinical, conceptual kind of approach. And I think there was something from that. Let me speak for myself because that's easier than trying to speak. Yeah, I felt very distrustful of anything that was kind of placed as a way of making that was true. Like anything, I felt like everything that you know, whether it was somebody talking about abstract expressionism or someone talking about London school painters like Freud, then somebody talking about, you know, like guys you had mentioned, all of this. And then there was this kind of position at the time where irony was like the thing, you know, and was so heavy in every single crit that you do. Like there was this kind of quite clumsy irony. And I think the effect of Kippenberger cannot be diminished on on anyone of my generation from all of that, you know, and particularly because, you know, the things that he did so well are so crude and on such an epic level that it's very difficult to replicate that without just making terrible work. You know, because at the end of the day, you know, you're not Kippenberger, and there was only one like that. But there, and it's also something that feels very accessible, and it's easy to be cynical and make work that's cynical, but it's difficult to use cynical to express something kind of generously. And in a way, like that perhaps is what someone like Kippenberger was interesting in, because you felt every part of him was there. However cynical he was about an idea, you feel like you're seeing his toenails there, you feel like you're seeing this other part of him, you know, like you're always faced with Kippenberger. But as a concept, that's very, very, like, it's very muddy water to step into. And so I just feel like we were kind of between, or a generation that was being educated after a bomb had gone off conceptually, you know, and we had this quite open space to work into, however much people wanted to say this is how you should do something or this isn't. For me, and I felt that with other artists I spoke to, and especially with international artists that I studied with, you know, that there was a real distrust of any dogma that would appear in art making, which for that I'm super grateful for. Yeah.
Right. I would just say that you're proving I have this theory that I haven't really written yet, but that there's something about being born around 85, 86, all of you, that I've said this many times before to students, that, like, you know, I'm still of a generation that I'm an abused child of modernism in terms of my teachers. And I think you guys were the first generation that it was possible for you to not have that in you at all. Like you do modernism, you do postmodernism, but you didn't really have it in your, like, DNA. And I think there's a difference, like the inclusiveness of Oliver saying that, like this idea of, you know, and can be recent, why not? You know, I would have been murdered in art school if I would have said that to a professor or something. It would not even have been, I would have been kicked out of the room. You know, so there's something about distance that your answer is fulfilling my thing. There's about all of you born in 85, 86, there's something in that range that's interesting to me. So watch this space. Yeah.
Looking forward to it. Yeah, and also, like, I would say, again, from my perspective, having not grown up around art and a Western art history, and having grown up very much, you know, looking at and being affected by Kenyan and East African artists. I mean, those are the guys that made me fall in love with this, and the whole thing of being an artist. For me, has also been really, really important in kind of illustrating the fallibility of taste. And, you know, this is completely off piste, actually, because now I'm just beginning to think about something different. But, you know, but to see something, and again, I had this reaction to Titian the first time I saw it, where I just thought they were terrible. I thought, bloody hell, that guy, you know, like, everyone's saying this is the most beautiful thing ever made. And it really, like, at that time for me was, I thought the guy couldn't use color. I thought, you know, like, the figures were too big. All these funny things were going on. And that's because, you know, what I was used to and wanted from a painting was based on what I saw growing up. And then to have that kind of thrown back every time like for me, I would talk about these guys, and you know, an answer I was once given, which really stuck with me, was perhaps the thing about it that's good is it's so bad. And I was like, I think this stuff's pretty good, you know, like I think this is great, you know. But what is relevant, I think, is basically why I'm going around this funny way, you know. I feel should be specific to every single artist. And I feel like it's, and I think if you're, I think it becomes problematic when the things that are relevant for you and are important aren't specific, you know. I think that's too detached.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Terry, for that question.
Yeah.
Before we move on, I really want to give a big thank you to Toby and to Michael for this wonderful talk. It was really enlightening and fantastic. And a thank you to all the questions that were asked, and an apology to the questions we didn't get to. So the Brooklyn Rail has a daily ritual of ending lunch with a poem, and today we're thrilled to have Rindon Johnson with us. Rindon Johnson is an artist and writer. He's the author of Nobody Sleeps Better Than White People, Inpatient 2016, the VR book, Meet in the Corner, and Shade the King. He lives in Berlin, where he's an associate fellow at the University of Kunst Berlin. He studies VR. All right, Rindon, are you? Oh.
Hey.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you, Michael. That was awesome. Super interesting. And thank you, Toby. I'm gonna read not my own work, but this book from the very first part of this book called Mojo Hand by J.J. Phillips, who is a queer Black female writer. This was published in 1966, and the beginning of this book is, I don't know, it made me think of your paintings, Michael, so I thought I'd read it. It goes like this. The new drop sun fell heavily to the ground by the pepper tree. The child was skipping rope when she saw it. The first thing she did was turn it over and pick it up. It was only about the size and weight of a basketball and looked like a ripe persimmon. She held the warm ball close to her stomach, then carefully placed it back by the pepper tree and ran to Colonel Jim's bait store to borrow an old smelt bucket. When she got back to the pepper tree, the sun was still there. The girl picked it up, pressed it to her stomach again, and laid it in the bucket. She walked to the screen door of the house and flattened her nose and forehead against it. She did not see her mother in the kitchen, and she went in. She went to the stairs and started to go up when her father, who had been reading in the living room, came over to her. What are you doing with that old fish bucket? I'm taking it to my room. Why? I want to put it in my room for a while. What's in the bucket? The sun. Oh, I see. No, it's really the sun. It fell by the pepper tree. Good God, it is the sun. I told you. Well, you can't keep the sun in a bucket. Get it out of here. I only wanted to keep it for tonight. Somebody does it every night, and tonight is my turn. You cannot keep the sun in a bucket in your room. Get it out of the house. Well, then who will keep it if I don't? I don't know, but I'm your father, and I say you cannot keep it. Here, give me the bucket. All right. Her father took the smelt bucket with the sun from her, put it carefully in the trunk of his car, drove the few blocks to the beach, and flung it into the surf. He put the rusty bucket back in the car and drove home. The sun sizzled as it hit the water, turned red, and floated out to the horizon to drop off somewhere else. Thanks.
Thank you, Rin. That was wonderful. So everyone, enjoy your weekend, and we invite you to join us on Monday for a conversation between Dr. Lucy Bowditch and Clifford Ross.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Michael.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rin. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Toby.
That was beautiful.
What a mind, Michael, man. You did a fantastic job.
People can feel free to turn on your mic and say bye on your way out.
Jared, great seeing you.
Cool.
Great,
Take
great
care.
Thank you
call,
so
Rin, too.
much. That was fascinating.
Yeah.
Good weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.
See you, Jason.
Amazing.